Ray Poynter here, and we're going to be working with qualitative data, finding the story in all of that qualitative information. This is part of a project which is leading to a book I'm writing, and the whole book is about finding and communicating the story in the data. And the aim, or maybe aspiration, is that it's going to be published about the middle of this year. So today, we're going to start off with just a few thoughts about what is qualitative data. Then I'm going to talk about the story finding framework, the framework I use, whether it's quant, qual, a combination of them. I'm going to focus a little bit on defining the problem and using the problem as a lens to look at the information. Then we're going to talk about finding the big picture, the role of automation, the role of theory when we're working with qualitative information, and then we will take Q&A. So what do we mean by qualitative data? Well, to some extent, it's everything and anything. So it is clearly text information. It can be text in books, it can be text typed into an online discussion, into a focus group discussion. All sorts of words are going to be one form of qualitative data. And one of the essences about those words is they are normally unstructured. They don't all fit into rows and columns of a grid, and we don't have the same amount of information from each person we're talking to. They can also be real-life observations. They can be signs on signposts. They can be photographs. They can be videos where we have recorded an interview with somebody, and then we go back and we look at the video and we listen to the sound, or we read the transcript to gain information. It can be activities. So shopping can be an activity. Watching somebody else shop can be an activity. All of that will generate qualitative information. And actually, quite often numbers can be a bit qualitative. The number 1 has a special meaning. 101, it's a foundational course. Or if you've read 1984, it's the room where your horrors are. 451 is the flashpoint of paper. It's the title of a book, Fahrenheit 451. Number 10 is where the Prime Minister of the UK lives. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the address of the President of the United States. Route 66 was a special route across America. Other numbers have particular meaning. So as well as being quantitative, quite often numbers will have some qualitative meaning to them too. What are the most typical types of qualitative data? I've said it can be anything, but it tends to be information from a focus group discussion. It tends to be from a depth interview or from online discussions. Or maybe we've got participant videos. People have used their smartphone to collect videos and they've uploaded them. Or we've done ethnographic observations. We've gone out into the field and we have watched closely the lived experience. Or we gather, read and analyse social media posts. Or we take the open-ended comments from surveys. All of these are relatively typical qualitative data. Now, I mentioned this framework, and this is the framework I apply and which I talk about in the book to all sorts of problems. We start by defining the problem, we assess the wider context, then we find the big picture. That tells us the shape of what we're looking for. Then we extract the key findings, we determine the message, create the story, communicate the story, and then follow up. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is in this find the big picture and extract the key findings. The most important part of this process is defining the problem. Because if you don't define the problem properly, you're unlikely to find the answer. Defining the problem properly is about half the whole task. What does this process of defining include? Well, asking what is the business question. We are often focused on what is the research question, and that's fine, but we should also know what is the business question. And that leads to understanding what are the research questions, assessing what do we already know, determining what does success look like for the sponsor of the client, for the person who has to make a decision, understanding what the business plan to do after they receive our answers, and also find out what people think the answers are going to be, because we're going to use those predictions to try to prove they're correct, and we're going to try to prove they're wrong. They will give us a real focus in looking at our information and in our story finding. Now, in an ideal world, when we're working with qualitative information, there is a symbiosis between the collection and the analysis. So we establish what is the question, what is already known, and we plan the research. Maybe it's going to be some focus groups. We do the research using the discussion plan. During the moderation of that group, we're doing some analysis. Following the group, we do some analysis, and you will almost always update your plan. You may need to invite slightly different people to the next focus group. You may want to change the discussion plan. You may want to add a little exercise. You may want to remove an exercise that wasn't delivering very much. And then we'll do more research, we'll do more analysis, and we'll update the plan. And then at the end of the process, we do the big analysis that's going to generate the story. So that's our ideal world, where we're going to pull those together as we go through the process. So if we're thinking about depths and focus groups, we'll create a discussion plan, we'll do some interviews, we'll do analysis, and we'll update the plan. If it's online discussions, or if they're asking people to collect digital diaries, again, we'll have a discussion plan or an activity plan. We'll get some responses, we'll do some analysis, and we will update the discussion plan or the activity plan. If it's ethnography or semiotics or social media, we'll have a search plan. We'll do some analysis, and then we will start to think about new locations. Do we need to visit different locations? Do we need to take sample from different locations? Do we need to use different sorts of materials? And we're going to be looking for confirming and disconfirming cases once we've started to get some ideas from our initial analysis. However, you may receive all of the data before the analysis starts. Somebody comes to you and says, we've done some social media scraping, here's the information, please analyse it. Here are the transcripts of some interviews we conducted. Can you help us analyse them? Here are the open ends from a whole set of surveys. Can you see what's already there? So what are we going to do then? Well, we're going to let the early analysis guide us on whether or not we can keep processing that data, or whether we have to say, no, I need additional material in order to make sense of this. I need to find some more cases. I need to find some alternatives in order to make sense of the story I'm finding. We need to think about the paradigm when we're doing qualitative research. We're doing constructionist research as opposed to positivist. We are not saying this actually exists in the world. We are creating a solution. We are creating a story that helps explain phenomena or helps give advice. Qual findings are a combination of the data, the information we have, the method we choose to use, and the analysis. It's the human part that we're bringing in through that analysis that matters. In a typical quant study, the findings are approximately the data and the method. Different methods give different findings, different data give different findings, but by and large, if you have the same data and the same method, you should get the same findings. With qualitative, no, if you have a different qualitative researcher, you should expect to get some degree of difference in the findings, because what they are bringing to the process through their own experience, their own lived experience, is going to be different. So here's kind of a summary of that. We've got a picture here of a dog and a slipper that's been shredded. So that's the data, the dog and the shredded slipper. The method, I'm going to use sense making as a method here. The analyst, me in this case, I'm aware of the history of slipper shredding. Many of my friends have talked about how dogs shredded their slippers. So my conclusion here, looking at this, is the dog chewed the slipper, but a human created the opportunity for the problem. That is a qualitative build on that data. And that's what we mean by a constructionist picture. One of the things that's really important when we're working with qualitative information is don't just describe what you saw. Don't repeat what people said. We need to explain what it means and why they said it and what the client, the decision maker, should do as a consequence. Imagine that we have this description. The man had quite a lot of white wine, Emmental cheese, which was grated, and Gruyere cheese, which was also grated. He also had a small amount of garlic, lemon juice, corn flour, and kirsch, as well as a large number of cubed bread pieces, and he seemed to be getting ready to cook using a large, heavy metal pot. The synthesis that I might want to do, the explanation, is he was making a classic Swiss-style fondue. If somebody has asked me what the man was doing, then that person may want to know he was cooking. He may want to know that he was preparing fondue, but it's very unlikely that he's going to want to know all of these descriptive details about what he'd observed. But we really do need to know what it is that people need to understand, because maybe the decision maker needs to understand why this person was making a fondue, or how did making a fondue meet his needs, or what impact did this man making a fondue have on the people around him. We need to understand the question if we're going to provide an answer. The answer is almost never going to be a detailed description of what we saw or what people said. What we're looking to create in qualitative analysis is a structure. And this is one which I captured from the internet, so you can see the link there yourself. And the person who had done this had done one type of analysis, and I'm going to take another analysis. But what we see here is they've collected lots of comments and grouped them, and they grouped together no uniform and no books as a type of comment, and then they group as codes. And other people were worrying, or their mind was elsewhere, they were tired at school. Those were the codes, and they then grouped those codes into concepts. So no uniform and no books was a lack of school materials. The school fees and the travel costs grouped together into the concept unable to pay school costs. Those two together grouped into a category can't afford school. We also had worry, mind elsewhere, tired in school, and headaches, which grouped into the category physically and emotionally stressed. And between them, we end up with the overall theory: these children have tangible problems, real problems that need addressing. What we're looking to do is to create a structure of understanding. This is not what we would use as the storytelling. This is our understanding of the structure and the information. We want to see it build together, and we want to see it complete. This use of the word coding is really different to what happens when we have, for example, open-ended comments in a quant survey, where we might have, why did you like the advert? And we see here, the boy and the music was why I liked the advert. The new pack, the way the young man opens the packaging. And we mechanistically allocate those to codes: boy, pack, music, nothing. And we put in noughts and ones for each of the open-ended comments so that we know what the frequency of boy is. We know what the frequency of pack, music, nothing, etc. are. That is one meaning of coding. What I'm talking about with this sort of structure is that we are using coding to ensure that we have closely read the text. And by the text, it might be photos, it might be videos, but we've looked at it and we've understood what is happening. What are the sorts of things that happen in this information set that relate to the question we have, and those are the codes. And then we think about how those codes combine together to make concepts. And we're not particularly interested in how often the reference to no books occurs compared with no uniform. Because what we're interested in is the overall structure of the story, and that those two codes exist and they link together to make the concept lack of school materials. Then we're going to link those together to create categories. This is quite separate from that mechanistic process we saw with the open ends in surveys. This is an intellectual exercise to make sure that we have looked at that information and come up with a sound structure. Now, there are lots and lots of formal methods for qualitative analysis. If you look in the social sciences and psychology and so on, you will see a wide range of these. These all tend to be somewhat corrupted and adulterated in the market research world, so we will often base our techniques loosely upon them. Grounded theory is great, but it takes a long time. We don't normally use real grounded theory or real narrative analysis, but we will use elements of one, two, or more of these. So please do read up on different sorts of formal analysis. Talk to colleagues about what they do and come up with your own combination that is based on some formal scheme and some practical adaptation. So I'm just going to look at a piece of text here that I've downloaded again from the internet, and there's the link there. And this was an interview with a dentist about the sorts of materials that they are purchasing. And we might imagine that the business question that was underlying the analysis was, what type of dentist is this, and how should we market our products to them? And so I look at this with a technique called conversation analysis. And we're looking at how people speak. There are pauses, repairs, and disconnects in there. So what we did, people, people. So we're seeing a lack of confidence in the way they're talking there. We sort of, again, relates to that. We're also noticing, in terms of the way the conversation happened, a restructured answer. They said, well, that's a good question. I don't know, I suppose. Then they laughed. This is because it looks as though this was not a good question. When people say, that is a good question, and then they pause and they rephrase the question, means that the question doesn't quite work for them. And if this only happened in one interview, then I might let it go. But if it happened a couple of times, I would really go back and I would change my questions so that I tried to find out the right way to ask the question, that it didn't require the participant to restructure it. We have a thing called footing when we look at discourse analysis. What role is somebody playing? We all play different roles in different conversations. When we are at school and we were sitting down, we played the role of the pupil, but then we went into the playground and we played the role of friend, and then we went home and we played the role of child. And as we became older, we played the role of parent. But maybe when we get back to work, we are going to play the role of somebody who is told what to do. So we have lots of different roles, and we want to look to see what sort of footing. And we see this reference, I don't know, I suppose, my own little, we sort of. So this clearly shows us that This dentist is looking at their role in terms of somebody who is not confident and they're doubtful about the sources available to him or her. We also look at repetition. And if we look at here, what did you take into account when you first decided to buy it? The first thing is, we looked at cost. It was the first thing they mentioned. But they never mentioned cost again. They did mention reliability more than once. They did mention internet sites more than once. So it begins to look like cost was one of those things that they thought they ought to say. Right up front, I'm going to say cost, because otherwise I'm going to look as though I'm not really being serious. But then they started to talk about the things that they did look at, because mentioning cost is a preferred response. When you're asked about what you take into account, you're kind of supposed to say cost. The fact it's not repeated, potentially telling us that reliability and going out onto the internet are more interesting. I also look at evaluative terms. Where do people put hate, love, loathe, enjoy? These sort of words, because when they associate those with opinions, we should take more recognition of them. So I quite like my own little research. I don't really trust the research that comes with the product. Are actually quite good, these internet forums. All of these have got these warm phrases or antagonistic phrases, but with more evaluation in them. And so we're going to pay a little bit more attention to them. So how do we then pull that information into a story based on what we've just seen? The dentist lacks confidence, but she mentions cost but comes back to the topic of reliability. She distrusts the research from manufacturers, so tries to do his or her own research by connecting with people who've used the new products, and they tend to do it via internet forums. What is the recommendation? Connect this type of dentist with happy users. There's no point sending them straightforward marketing materials, giving them a sales call that talks about how good you are. And try to encourage reliability testimonials and social media posts from existing customers. Try to put your information where this person is going to look. So we're looking to find a story. We're going to use the client's question as the lens. We're going to read that information, we're going to tag it, we're going to put in these codes, we're going to write memos as we go through. Don't assume you will remember where everything is. If you're using one of the clever tools like NVivo, that's really good. At the very least, highlight things, copy them so that you know where in the video you go back to find that, where in the text you go back to get that quote again. You want to challenge what is known, believed and predicted. I'm going to talk about that process a little bit more in a moment. And then we're going to find the main story, because once we find the main story, we can find relevant exceptions and differences. So don't start off by saying, well, this person thought this and this person thought this and this person thought that. What do we see as the overwhelming picture? What are the bones of the big picture? And then look into the detail. Once we've got this overall structure or the plot, we can really work on the detail. We also need to think about whether it's good news or bad news, because this comes to how we're going to communicate the story at the end. When we are communicating good news, it's normally quite easy. When we're communicating bad news, this product is a real failure, people don't like it, it's much harder to convince the end user of the information, the decision maker, that it's right. So you will need to get more evidence when you're going to be delivering bad news. So we're going to use the question as a lens, and we're going to find clues in the information for the survey, for the story. We're going to look for connections, contradictions, curiosities, surprises and omissions, and then assemble the story. So connections. What things tend to go together? So I was looking at the feedback about a pub/restaurant in a hiking area. And there was a really interesting pattern in the information. Many people at the end of a day's walking liked the pub, the service, and the food. Many people who had driven to the pub did not like the service and the food, but they liked the building location. So once we've seen that connection, we then want to investigate more. Did the two groups have different expectations or needs? Did the staff have more affinity with the hikers? Did the presence of the hikers detract from the experience for some of the non-hikers? These are the sorts of things that we would then start to explore before we would come up with the story and with the recommendations for what the pub restaurant should do. Contradictions. Again, looking at review data, and this time it was TripAdvisor for the Eiffel Tower. An interesting group emerges in there who embody this contradiction. They felt they had to visit the Eiffel Tower. They didn't really enjoy it, but afterwards they still felt they had to have done it. So there were obviously some people, I went there, I didn't enjoy it, wish I'd never done it. That's not a contradiction, that's straightforward. But there were people who were still saying that I needed to do that. So this is a contradiction in terms of what we expect the rationale to a visit to be. Normally we would expect people who didn't enjoy it to say, I wish I hadn't done it. So what would we do next? We would explore, would not knowing what it was like have been a worry? So if I'd never been there, I wouldn't know that I didn't like it, and that would worry me. Or did people worry what others would say if you didn't visit it? What, you went to Paris and you didn't go up the Eiffel Tower? Or even, did they feel it was a necessary duty? You know, like you visit a relative, maybe they're not a close relative, but you're in the neighbourhood and you have to do the visit. So is it that sort of thing? And maybe this would create business opportunities. Could people get their Eiffel Tower hit quicker with less fuss and paying a small fee for it? Create some sort of business opportunity, a straight up, straight down. You get in the lift, you don't really get out. I don't know, but something along those lines. Curiosities. Just before the year 2000, there was a real growth in the supply of handheld GPS devices. And these were being marketed to help hikers navigate the wilds, places without roads and signs. In conversations with the early adopters, it became clear that the main actual use was to collect information on how many steps had been taken, how far the route had been, and what was the average speed, and how much height was gained and lost. Now, they weren't using it for navigation. Most of these hikers were very confident with maps and compasses. So they had a GPS, but that kind of felt like an intrusion into the map reading process. But they loved collecting all of this information about their walk. And note, this predated the rise of things like the Fitbit and using Apple Watch to collect exercise data. So, ideas to explore. Always look at what people are doing. And if they are doing what is not what was intended, it could be your next best step. Heinz made those plastic bottles that were upside down because they went into people's houses and they saw they were doing it with the bottles themselves. A number of drinks have been created because they copy what people did. So quite often, if we see a curiosity, people doing something not in the way we intended, that can be a great opportunity. Surprises often stem from having the wrong expectations. So I remember quite a few years ago, doing a project for a client, and they wanted us to do focus groups with tech engineers to see why these engineers were choosing chip X, their competitor, over chip Y, their chip, given that their chip Y, was better. Were there advertising reasons, marketing reasons, logistical reasons? Were they buying the one that was from their own country as opposed to the American chip for nationalistic reasons? So we had a discussion guide that was going to explore this. And very quickly, we discovered that the engineers who were using X and Y had found that X was better than Y. So we had to tear up the discussion guide, pivot, and change the research. We had to start exploring what criteria were the engineers using to define better. Were they wrong in any of their facts? Had the client misunderstood about the comparison between X and Y? So these are the sorts of prizes. We have a wrong assumption on the part of the stakeholder, the client, maybe ourselves, about why something is happening. We see that that it doesn't bear out. And quite often, as I say, that is the time to pivot. Change the way we're doing the research, change the discussion plan, change the analysis so we answer the right question. And the final one is omissions. What did people not say? What did they not do? What did they not take a photo of? So a project that I was doing with some local students on a business master's course were asked to capture photos of their meals over the weekend. And then we analysed those. And when we as a group analysed the pictures, it was noticeable that almost nobody had collected a photo of a boring meal. There were no simple soups. There were no simple sandwiches. There were no beans on toast. There were lots of really quite special meals. So, thinking about this omissions, think about if you're reading the reference for a prospective new employee. You should always pay attention to the omissions. Did they mention punctuality? Did they mention accuracy? Did they mention ability to get on with others? If it's not there, it should speak loudly to you. The reason somebody has not said that this person has got a good work attitude is probably because they don't. We don't write the negative things these days in most references. People will often omit something when they're looking at a product or at a test or telling you about a service. Those omissions can be really important. One of the things I mentioned earlier was confirming and disconfirming, and we should proactively look at who should like it, who shouldn't like it. If this is true, we should see this over here in the information set. So if people who love your brand don't like the new idea you're testing, then it's probably bad. If people who don't like you like it, then it's probably good. So these are rim cases that are going to give you some guidance. If people who say they would buy it can't say when they would buy it and how they would use it, and in particular where they might store it in their house, if it's a kitchen product or a cooking product, then their purchase is disconfirmed. If people who say they would buy it can describe how they would buy it, where they would store it, how they would use it, then we have confirming evidence. It's not just that they've tested it and said, yes, I think I would use it. They can tell us, and I'd probably buy it from this retailer. I would store it with my spices, which are just over there. I would use it when I'm cooking meats and I'm looking to have this particular effect. That is a much more confirming picture of, oh yeah, I really like the taste of this. I'm sure I would buy it. When would you use it? I'm not sure. One of the techniques that we see elsewhere that we can use with qualitative research is finding the root causes by using the 5 whys. So this actually comes from engineering originally. The car won't start. Why? The battery is dead. That's the first why. So why was the battery dead? Well, the alternator's not functioning. That was our second why. Why was the alternator not functioning? The alternator belt has broken. That was the third why. Why had the belt broken? The alternator belt was well beyond its useful service life and had not been replaced. Why had the belt not been replaced? The vehicle was not maintained according to the recommended service schedule. That is what I mean by digging deeper. We don't just want to report the what, the battery is dead, or even the superficial why, the alternator's not functioning, so the battery was dead. We want to try to get as many whys into that process as we can. You can do this by probing why during the data collection process, or if it's not an interview type process, looking at additional information, following back in time. So if we've got video, looking earlier. If we're looking at social media, what came before it, or if people talked about what came before it. If we're doing ethnographic observations, what happened earlier before the event that we're highlighting. So this is one of my favourite examples of spotting the story in the information. And this is from Nora Ephron, who before she was a screenwriter was a journalist, and she grew up in California in Beverly Hills. She went to the journalism school there, and on the first day, evidently, they were taught about the 5 W's: who, what, when, where and why, which are great principles for market researchers as well, and are essential principles for journalists. They were also taught about the lead, which is the little bit of story that works like the clickbait that's going to make you want to read the whole story. So the lead is now the clickbait in a lot of modern media. And they were given this short story and asked to write the lead. So here is the short story. The entire school faculty will travel to Sacramento next Thursday for a colloquium in new teaching methods. Among the speakers will be anthropologist Margaret Mead, college president Dr. Robert Maynard Hutchins, and California Governor Edmund Brown. All the students started typing away on those old-fashioned typewriters, and they all wrote about the 5 W's, and the teacher went down the class picking up what they'd written and said, good but not right, good but not right. And then the teacher shared the real lead of this story for the school newspaper. No school next Thursday. That isn't in the information, it's of the information. It's as a consequence of the information. The entire school faculty will travel to Sacramento next Thursday. The entire school faculty are gone next Thursday. No school next Thursday. That is the process that we're looking to achieve. Now, a couple of times I've mentioned numbers as we're going through, and in most qualitative work we do, there actually are very few numerical concepts. The ones that I'd recommend we use are nobody. Nobody in any of the groups I conducted liked it. Nobody in any of the groups said they would use it for this purpose. Closely associated with almost nobody. So this means there is no support for that idea. The other end of the scale, almost everybody. And even better, everybody. So if we have that process, then that is quite a good indication that there's been a general rejection or a general acceptance of something. And then in between those, we have a few and many. And those are really all of the numbers we work with when we are looking at a sample of social media, when we're looking at our ethnographic observations, when we are taking the results of online discussions or focus groups or depth interviews. Pretty much those are the numbers we need to lean against. Now, there are some other uses of numbers. Sometimes we want to transform qualitative data into quant data. That is not qualitative analysis. That is not qualitative analysis at scale. That is quant analysis. And it can be really useful. So, for example, if we've got some open-ended questions in a survey and we ask people to cite something. So, which product do you usually buy? And people type in the names of products in an open-ended way. We really do want to convert that into numbers. How many people said Coke? How many people said Pepsi? How many people said Fanta and Sprite? in lots of variations with spelling mistakes, and we just want to recode that back into quantitative information. We might want to measure sentiment. So are comments about the brand positive or negative? So we're looking at all the social media measurements around Apple or around Disney or around one of these major brands. And we are going to want to know whether the feeling about the brand is changing. If it is changing, we will then do some deep dive research to find out why it's changing. We might want to categorize responses. So we've got a Net Promoter Score question. People give it a number, 0 to 10, and then they're asked an open-ended question, why did you say that? We might want to do some automatic grouping of the people who are detractors to see what are the reasons. And then over time, we will want to see whether or not the people who said it was a problem with the staff are increasing or decreasing. The people who say it's a problem with the product, increasing or decreasing. So we take these buckets, we want to allocate the comments into the buckets, and then we want to be able to see whether the size of the buckets is changing. We also look at trends in massive data sets. So is the level of happiness in society changing? Are we seeing more people talking about vegan-related issues in the popular press? These sorts of things. And for looking at those really big trends, you don't have another option other than the quantitative analysis of qualitative underlying information. The key to all of these is you actually know what the answers are, but you want to assign numbers to the answers. And that is a quantitative mindset. Normally what really differentiates qualitative is you don't know what the answers are. Closely associated with what I've just been talking about is the use of automation, algorithms, and artificial intelligence. And there are two quite separate ways that we do this. The first is to make qualitative analysis more efficient. NVivo is a really good example of a product that does that. Tools that will search words, images, and videos. Tools that will automatically translate different languages. Tools that will give us transcriptions of videos. Things that will allow us to count the words, frequencies, what are the structures, and the phrases that exist in there. All of those are useful. So you might be looking through there and somebody talks about disenfranchisement, the removal of the vote. You think, how many times does that come up? And what other words are used near it? So I'm going to search through and find all the other terms, all the other situations where disenfranchisement is used and read around those. And then I'm going to have a look at maybe voting restrictions, voting rights, other things that link to disenfranchisement to get a sense of where in these 1 million words I'm looking at, what it is that people are saying when they're talking about this concept. So I'm using the automation, algorithms, and AI to allow me to work faster with the information. Or I'm going to conduct analysis at scale. So you'll see references to computational text analytics. And these look at big patterns. We're still in the early days of this, but there's some really good evidence that looking for the right sorts of things, this works. This will tell you about whether patterns in the data are changing, the number of major reasons that people do things. I might be using AI or automation to take tasks like coding of an ongoing project. So if we've got that NPS study I mentioned earlier, and we're collecting data every month, and we've been doing it for years, it is now relatively straightforward to set up an automated coding algorithm that will code the vast majority of next month's open ends. They will do that because the variation between next month and the last 12 months is so small. But you just need to keep an eye on it for when there is quite a radical change. There will have been quite a change when the pandemic broke back in February, March 2020. A lot of the open ends about services will have changed, and for a while the automated coding would have been problematic, but it would soon be sorted. The final one is you do see people talk about replicating human scale qual. So being able to do thousands and thousands of interviews in the same way that a human. It's very early days, and I'm being polite here in an English way and saying there is limited evidence. That's kind of English for there is no good evidence of this working yet. But it may come. So we've found all of those nuggets in the information. We want to build stories. And what I tend to do is as I go through, I'm making notes, memos of the pieces, the nuggets. And then I go through them and I start grouping them because I want to end up with a structure where I've got some facts, then I've got some findings, and then I've got some secondary findings, and then I've got an insight. This is very much like the codes, concepts, categories, theory that I was talking about earlier. So to do that, I can take my facts and I start putting them into piles. Some of them I can immediately see are just nice to know, so I put them to one side. I keep on putting them into collections until I've allocated all of my facts. And once I've done that, I can start thinking about the findings, or those are the codes, so what are the concepts? Here are my concepts. Once I've got those, I start thinking about how I'm going to group them. Here's another concept. And then we can start producing second level findings amongst those, more in the range of categories. And then we're going to get the overall insight, the theory, the thing that allows us to create the solution. And that, of course, should be targeted at creating action. And that's going to be the topic of the next webinar. Now, another way of thinking about that process is the concept of cut-ups. Cut-ups has got a really long history. Dadaism in the art use cut-ups, different bits and pieces put together. William Burroughs, the beat poet, again, cut up words, moved them around and created things. David Bowie very famously used to cut up lyrics and move them around in order to create his storytelling in the process. So we can go through and look at all the bits and pieces we find, and for each discussion or image or smoke from video, find the story, put that down on a little card, perhaps with color coding, move the cards around, similar cards go closer together. We can start to see which ones are just nice to have. Missing links suggest that we need more analysis. Sometimes you have step A, B, C, E. That means you've got to go and look for D. Find evidence, or you have to change your theory if you can't find any evidence of D. And that's going to allow you to build the story architecture. So just to summarize that, we're going to use the question as a lens. We're going to make the patterns easier to see by looking for connections, contradictions, curiosities, surprises, and omissions. And then we're going to assemble the story. We don't want a shopping list of what was said. I think the most disappointing qualitative debriefs I ever see are page after page of quotes. People who liked it said this. People who didn't like it said that. That is just a description. That is a shopping list. What we want is to describe the process. This was the meal. This was the people who went there. This is why they went. This is what they got from going there. This is our opportunity as a consequence of knowing that information. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.